We're all going to die one day, but I'm not going to die for you.
In 1999, death didn't knock. It kicked the door down. A madman with a knife made it all the way to Harrison's bedroom. George survived that night, but death had already started the clock. Being a Beatle is a life sentence. You don't retire. You die on stage. By November 2001, the universe called in the bar tab for 40 years of rock and roll. No cameras in the private clinic. Just Paul McCartney and a dying Mr. Smith. What happened next was the finale. After that, there's only silence. The world wouldn't let George Harrison go. For the press, a dying Beatle isn't a tragedy, it's pay dirt. The second the news of the cancer leaked, his life became the aquarium. The walls of his home turned transparent. Reporters circled the gates like vultures, waiting for the fish to float belly up. The glass in that tank wasn't there to protect him, it was there to keep the smell of meds away from the audience while they enjoyed the show of his decay. They wanted to broadcast his end live, turning a legend's fade out into a reality show. But George knew the rules of the cesspool. He realized he dived into an ocean of fame only to find a swamp full of sharks. If you bleed in public, they won't stop until the bones are picked clean. He needed a place to be a man again, not an exhibit. So he did the only thing he could. He vanished. The official line for the papers was, "Mr. Harrison is undergoing routine recovery." Press agents smiled and talked about positive progress. It was a damn lie. On paper, it looked like a medical procedure. In reality, it was a military evacuation. He wasn't moved like a patient, he was moved like a high-value witness with a hit on his head. Convoy, aliases, tinted windows. He fled LA to die without the camera flashes. He turned his room at Staten Island University Hospital into the silent room. No phones, no leaks. Security didn't check IDs for insurance, they checked for bugs. The staff signed NDAs where one slip of the tongue cost more than their yearly salary. Inside that fortress, time slowed down. Official reports spoke of a fight for life. But the people swapping the IVs and clearing the untouched trays saw the truth. There was no fight. There was only cold acceptance. On paper, hope. Inside, only morphine and silence. Editors screamed for a photo and got nothing. George Harrison, the man who gave the world "Here Comes the Sun," chose to go into total darkness, and he only let one man into that dark. George Harrison spent his final ounces of strength building that wall of silence. He wanted to check out without witnesses. But history is written by the ones left standing. Take your seat in the jury box, hit the button or scan the code so this archive doesn't vanish. Your signature is the only guarantee that we keep digging for the truth. That's all it takes. And now, footsteps in the hallway. Security stepped aside. There was one visitor you just don't turn away. The guard on duty moved to block the path, then froze. He recognized the face that had been printed on pop culture currency for 40 years. But this wasn't the Paul McCartney from the glossy covers. The night shift saw the truth the news cycles would never touch. The guard, a 50-year-old veteran who thought he'd seen it all, later told his own people. His hands were shaking when he tucked his ID back into his wallet. It wasn't the cold, and it wasn't old age. He looked like a man walking toward the gallows, not a meeting with a friend. In room 7, according to the faceless medical charts, lay a man named Mr. Smith. To the world outside those walls, he was an icon, a guitar deity. But to the nurse swapping his IVs, he was just a body. She saw what the obituaries ignored. She saw the disease methodically grinding him into dust. Cancer doesn't negotiate, it just seizes territory, inch by inch, leaving nothing of the great George Harrison but a low wheeze. His lungs sounded like a broken accordion, and every breath was a loan taken at a predatory interest rate. Paul entered that hallway without an entourage. No cameras, no Sir Paul mask with the permanent smile. For decades, the tabloids fed us stories about the Cold War inside the Beatles. The lawsuits, the lawyers, how George couldn't stomach Paul's ego. The official line was, "They're colleagues but not friends." But the janitor mopping the floor saw something that incinerates every lie ever printed. She didn't see billionaires splitting royalties. She saw two terrified kids from Liverpool who suddenly realized the game was over. Paul walked across that cheap linoleum like he was carrying 40 years of history on his shoulders instead of a coat. Nobody had to call for quiet on the set. The hospital hustle died on its own. Orderlies and nurses froze by instinct, feeling the weight of the moment. They remember the absolute, ringing silence that hung in the air when he reached the door. The nurse silently opened the door to Mr. Smith's room. Paul stepped into the shadows. The door closed, and the sound of that click was louder than any final chord at Shea Stadium or Wembley. In that room, there were no Beatles anymore. Just two men and the bar tab that finally had to be settled. When the door closed behind Paul, the world stopped existing. There was only the sterile white and the sound of the ventilator, counting down seconds like a metronome. Paul McCartney sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't take off his coat, as if he was afraid that if he got too comfortable, the reality of the situation would swallow him whole. Before him lay a shadow. The disease had done its job. It had devoured the meat, leaving only sharp cheekbones and eyes that saw things the living couldn't reach. Paul didn't offer sympathy or empty talk. He did the only thing that mattered. He reached out and covered George's hand with his own. The same fingers that once found the chords for "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." Now they were cold and brittle, like dry twigs. Official biographers will tell you they reminisced about the past. Bullshit. When you're at a deathbed, you don't swap old tour stories from Hamburg. You speak the truth. No one recorded this conversation. But those close to the family remember how the air changed that day. They say Paul didn't cry. He looked at his friend with the hardness of a man who knows nothing can be fixed. He leaned in close to George's ear. In this silence, there was no room for fakes. Paul spoke a phrase that wasn't a question. It was a verdict on their shared fate. Witness memory reconstructs it like this. You were my baby brother, and baby brothers aren't supposed to go first. George, a man who spent his life seeking spiritual meaning, didn't quote scripture. He just squeezed Paul's hand, faintly, almost invisible. But for McCartney, that handshake weighed more than all the gold records on his studio walls. This was 0 hour. In that room, there was zero pretense. In that moment, the old grudges burned to ash. The lawyers, the contracts, the fights over song credits, all of it turned to dust. All that was left were two kids who once hopped a bus in Liverpool, not knowing the route would lead to the top of the world and end here, in a room on Staten Island. Paul sat there for hours. He stroked George's hand until the nurse delicately hinted the patient needed morphine and rest. When Paul stood up, he didn't look back. He knew the rule. If you look back, you crumble right there on the floor. He walked out with dry eyes. He kept his game face on. He was a Beatle. The breakdown didn't happen until the parking lot. Witnesses saw him collapse into the car and sob the moment the tinted glass cut him off from the world. But in that hallway, he played his most difficult role. This was the edit. He cut out his own pain so his dying friend wouldn't have to see it. Because in this script, he didn't have the right to be weak. We don't need the tabloids. The driver saw it all. Paul walked those 10 seconds to the limo with a dead face. No tears. He wasn't carrying a coat, he was carrying his childhood's casket. Only when the tinted glass hit the frame did the mask crack. It wasn't a sob, it was the howl of a wounded animal. The papers say cancer won. That's a lie. This was a buyout. George looked at the circus, the contracts, the tours, the suits, and cut the cables. He didn't wait for the curtain. He walked out the back door while the show was still running. 2 weeks later, he was ashes in the Ganges. No grave, no magnets for the tourists. He did what he promised 40 years ago. He wiped himself off the map. He didn't even leave the system a body to monetize. All that's left is an echo and the silence. And in this business, silence is the loudest scream there is.